Right, got it going. Okay, so once again, want to welcome everybody out. Hope you're surviving the last few weeks, finals included. Hopefully this will be a little bit of a respite from all that, as our speakers are going to be talking about something very timely today. And we're not only grateful, but excited to have both Dr. John Douglas and Dr. Sarah Herr with us today. John Douglas is currently a vice president at statistical research and is the director of research and standards for the firm, as well as an adjunct professor in the School of Anthropology at the University of Arizona. Dr. Sarah Herr is president and primary owner of Desert Archaeology Incorporated. Both of these companies, by the way, are, if you didn't know, are one of the large, or two of the larger firms in not only the US, but definitely in the Desert West. And both Dr. Douglas and Dr. Herr are experts in this region, and we're super excited to have them. They will be speaking today about cultural resource management, which, as you guys, many of you know, is the contract side of archaeology, and specifically about how it is being affected by the pandemic. And this is based on a very recent article I have here right in front of me from the SA Archaeological Record, which is the quarterly magazine of the Society for American Archaeology. Here's their article if you want to read it or get more detailed information about what they're talking about today. But without further ado, I'm going to turn the time over to John, who will be discussing, or who will be doing the presentation today, and then they'll both be available for Q&A at the end of the discussion. So let's welcome everybody with a quiet clap.
Well, thanks so much, Mike. And Jacob, those are great introductions, and Sarah and I are really appreciative of BYU inviting us to come to such an exotic location this afternoon from our homes. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can everybody see that okay? Yep. Okay, so today Sarah and I wanted to talk a bit about cultural resource management and the early months of the pandemic. We'll touch a little bit more on some of the current things going on today, but our research really comes out of the first few months of the pandemic and a survey that we did back in the late spring, early summer that we were able to get published this fall. So there we go. So, so this is Sarah and me for quite some time now, since the springtime after the pandemic started. Almost every Saturday, Sarah and I have walked through a different historic neighborhood in Tucson because we're both really interested in heritage management and cultural resource management and learning more about where we live. And we're thinking about maybe doing a publication about it. But, you know, in any given day on a Saturday, we keep socially distanced on our walks, but certainly the reality of the situation for many of us is this. And, you know, the pandemic we first started really hearing about it in late January. Back in very late January, some friends of mine and my wife Jill's were down from Seattle, and the wife of the couple is the vice president of research at one of the research cancer institutes there in Seattle. And she started telling us about some of the identifications that her institute had been doing of these flu-like symptoms that didn't turn out to be flu. And that was some of the early discussion, which later turned out to be COVID-19 and the pandemic. And it came out really quickly, right? We first started hearing about it in January, and by March, it was early March, it was declared a pandemic. And almost immediately, things dramatically started to change our lives, our economy, and everything else. And you can see in this graphic, an 8.7% reduction in the food and service industry during the month of March, because basically everybody was going home, right? And this has had catastrophic effects on every element of our lives. Clearly, the number of cases has kept on going up. But back in March, the middle of March, here in Tucson, the stay-at-home order came down right around March 15th, March 23rd, somewhere like that. And I think for many of us, if we were able to go home and work, and clearly a lot of Americans were not able to, we naively believed what people were telling us that, oh, you know, in 6 weeks or so, we'll be able to go back to our normal lives. So, you know, the number of cases has been almost logarithmically increasing, and it's just continued to increase. And late last week, we got over the sad benchmark of over 200,000 cases in one day. So just some other little background about the economy and you know, in general. If you can see this, this is actually the front page of the New York Times from March 27th, just a couple of weeks after many of us went home. And this is very clear, right? This is the recession in 2008, 2010. You can see the total number of unemployed. And we have this is the top of the unemployment graphic for March 27th, just several weeks after everybody went home. All sorts of millions and millions of people, 3.5 million people were out of work at that point. Many of them were in the restaurant industry. And just a few short weeks later, 22 million people are out of work. So that, if that's not dramatic, I don't know what is. And luckily, you know, when we think about the types of jobs today, about half of those 22 million people have gotten their jobs back, but there's still over 13 million people out of work at the moment, which is just horrible. But, you know, one of the things about the cultural resource management industry that Sarah and I are leaders in our firms is that the CRM industry almost immediately in most states and in most counties were deemed essential. And so that's one of the themes that's going to be coming through in our talk today is this concept of being essential and what that means. And we also have a lot of different images. Images like this are ones that Sarah's taken over the years from public art here in Tucson on sides of buildings and things like that, just to give you a sense of some of the artwork here in Tucson. But just as one example of what we're talking about when we talk about being essential, I just went to the New Mexico Department of Health website back a few months ago, back in September, when we first gave a variation on this talk. And I just looked at the infrastructure operations list from the Department of Health website to try to understand what sort of industries have been deemed essential in the state of New Mexico. So if you look at this list, it's a wide variety of list from everything from the telecommunications industry to, you know, the nuclear industry to public works and highways and things like that. And this is just a few of the different industries that were deemed essential by the Department of Health, for which CRM and archaeology play a very strong part. Another one that I, you know, for my firm specifically, not so much Sarah's, I don't think, but the nuclear materials research and enrichment industry, we actually have a large contract up in Los Alamos in northern New Mexico, which is, you know, historically been one of the big R&D places for the nuclear industry. And so there's a lot of archaeology associated with that as well as built environment sorts of things, historic buildings and things like that. So that might be another one I should have highlighted. But as you can see across the board, there's a lot of different industries from, you know, water and power, transmission lines, roads, Department of Defense, which is, you know, a very big piece here in the West. You know, they have so much land and they've been deemed essential, and there's a lot of archaeology that they have to deal with. And so there's a lot of different aspects of everyday life that CRM takes a part in, for which we weren't under the stay-at-home order. We were allowed to go out and do the kind of work that we were required to do by our clients. So today we wanted to think a bit about aspects of CRM and issues of health, safety, and economics, and how that all relates to COVID-19 over the past 10 months. And so some of the questions that we asked were, how risky is doing CRM during COVID? How are CRM firms responding to COVID? And how has COVID affected the CRM industry as a whole? So these are, kind of 30,000 foot view kinds of questions. And so one of the things we did to try to answer these questions was Sarah and I have a pretty good relationship with a lot of different folks in the industry across the United States. And Sarah also, both of our firms are part of something called the American Cultural Resource Association, ACRA. And Sarah has been a leader in that over the years as well. And so those were some of the entrees for us to reach out to leaders in 22 different firms across the United States to try to get some answers to some fundamental questions, to try to find out how CRM has been affected. And so this is just a list of the different firms showing, what part of the country they are, whether they're a regional firm, a national firm, international, things like that. Some firms like Sarah's firm, Desert Archaeology, really focuses on Arizona and the American Southwest. The firm I work for is Statistical Research. We have offices across the Western US, from the US Southwest to California to the Pacific Northwest. And we work in a larger footprint. But some of these firms here are large engineering firms. So they're nationwide, like Tetra Tech, Terracon. Some of those firms are national firms. Other firms are not quite mom and pop, but they're relatively small, very specialized sorts of firms that only do very specific things, like different kinds of analysis or ethnography or things like that that are highly specialized. So today we're, as part of this presentation, we're going to be thinking a lot about what it means to be essential and what that means in this context, and also about the effects of teamwork. Because when you're doing CRM in general, it's never a solitary sort of endeavor. You're always part of a team, a multidisciplinary team, which many times includes tribal members as well. And so we'll be talking about some of those things. And I think this quote here, that COVID casts a different kind of rhythm and it's hard to plan, I think it's very accurate and very true. And I think for you guys in academia, I'm sure that is true as well. As I mentioned just before we got started, I teach a course each fall at the University of Arizona. And last spring, when I was talking to the director of the School of Anthropology, she asked me, John, we don't know where we're going to be. We don't know whether we're going to be teaching in person or whether it's going to be online. And, how would you feel about being online? And at the time, I felt like, because I have so many guest speakers in the class and things of that nature, and it's about building relationships between them and the students, I really didn't want it to be online. And so I said, I will if I have to. But, clearly, I don't know about BYU, but almost every class at the University of Arizona is online. And only during the semester have they slowly started to open it up to a very small number of classes to be in person. And frankly, right now, I would not want to be in person. I've been to my office at Statistical Research probably a half dozen times in the last 10 months, and that was enough for me. So, so it's COVID really, it's hard to plan it because you don't know what's coming, right? I mean, that graphic before in terms of numbers, we thought that June was pretty bad. Well, today's a lot worse than June across the United States. So, but back in the spring, we didn't really know what was going to happen. And so one of the first things that happened was, if you were able to start working from home, you did. And so there were a lot of empty parking lots across town, whether it was in offices or restaurants or anything like that. In the background, this is in downtown Tucson, and in the background, this is one of the most favored restaurants people have in Tucson. And normally this parking lot would be packed full of people at the end of the day, and there's not a single car, right? This is an example just from the newspaper over the weekend, right? This was the 49ers game, and you can see all of the fake people, right? The cutouts of people, and these games are being played with canned cheers and things like that because there's no one in the stadium. So things have really changed, and I'm sure a few months ago the 49ers never thought that they'd be playing games this way, right? But in terms of CRM, Nate Boyles is the president of Metcalf Archaeological Consulting. They're out of Colorado. They've got offices all across the kind of Intermontana region. And Nate, we got quotes from all folks from these 22 firms, and there's a number of them in this presentation. And I think Nate's quotation here is really helpful in terms of thinking about this, in terms of taking baby steps, and what a lot of firms did early on. They really, once folks started to go home, you're trying to engage them and bring them back in, even if it's remotely over the lunch hour and things like that. And maybe BYU did that, this fall through these lectures and things like that, or a variety of other things to try to make sure that you're connecting with folks. And so, in March, a lot of people, if they could, went home, and this is kind of an idealized view of what that may have looked like, right? Got lots of space, nothing at your table, you're working, you're focused. But the reality may be something more like this, right? This is a screenshot from an interview that Sarah actually did with Emily Dietrich just a couple of months ago, for a video podcast series that's on YouTube called Tea and Trowels, which is fantastic, right? And in the middle of the interview, because Emma's working from home, her cat starts, interacting with them and climbs up, and Emma's trying to, shoo the cat away or have a conversation with the cat during the middle of her interview with Sarah, right? And I think of a recent NewsHour program where at the end of the program, Lisa Desjardins, she's just finished speaking, and you can hear her cat crying at her feet because it's hungry during the middle of a national, interview. So, these sorts of things happen, right? And this is another great example. Catherine Leonard, the Arizona SHPO, keyed Sarah and me in on this. This is a woman who got a phone call. She's a professor somewhere, and she's gotten an interview. She's gotten a call about an interview that's going to happen with CNN or one of the news shows in 45 minutes. And she's an expert in this field, and so she had to not only get her head around what kinds of questions she was going to be asked, but get ready for the interview. And so she looks very put together, right? She's got a nice background. She's got a nice blazer on. But she asked her husband to take a view from the side of the same point in time during this interview, and this is what it looked like. So she's wearing shorts, she's wearing sandals, there's kids' toys everywhere, but you can't see any of that in the screenshot. And I can't tell you how many lectures and several public talks I've given in the last 10 months, barefoot and wearing shorts, from my house, right? I've never given a public talk in barefoot before. So, for all of us, this is the reality of the pandemic and working from home. And it's very difficult, right? There's all sorts of things that we all have to deal with, and folks in CRM have had to deal with as well. Things like childcare and schooling, and for months on end, your kids are at home, right? How are you dealing with that and trying to juggle? If it's a two-parent couple, how are you going to juggle that in terms of if you both work full time, trying to get all this stuff done and also take care of the family and the kids? Is your internet up to snuff? Here in Tucson, in my neighborhood, I can't tell you how many times in the last several weeks, the internet in our neighborhood has gone down from a few minutes to a few hours. I've had to go to the office a couple of times because I've had critical things I had to get out, and I couldn't because the internet was down in my neighborhood. Workspace. I'm really lucky. My wife's really lucky here at home. We both have dedicated space. This is our guest bedroom, and it's also my office. My wife has one of the other bedrooms, and we've actually just purchased, ironically, at the beginning of the pandemic, a 1940s Adobe here in town near our house for Jill to turn into an office. So we're really lucky, and a lot of people are not, right? You're working at the dining room table. You're shifting around spaces, whatever you have to do. Office equipment. One of the things we discovered was at the beginning of the pandemic for a lot of firms, people literally took everything they possibly could out of their office, whether it was desk lamps, desktops. I've got my second screen from the office here at home. People were taking desks, desk chairs, whatever you needed, right? To make sure that you could make do at home. Zoom and Skype, I really wish I bought, some shares in Zoom before all of this occurred. Do you have all the materials? I'm in the middle of doing something. Oh, I just need to get that off my bookshelf. Oh no, it's at the office. Do I need to go into the office and get it? Is that something that's worth the risk? I don't know. A lot of folks that are archaeologists, if you're an analyst, you may need to be bringing artifacts home. And as I'll talk about a little bit later, sometimes that can be a little bit difficult. What is the contract language? What does the contract allow? Is it only supposed to be at the office? Can we ship it out of state and send it to somebody's home because we planned for them to come to our office and analyze it and now they can't come? It's these sorts of things. And finally, for a lot of people, clearly in academia and all sorts of different employment backgrounds, isolation is a real factor for a lot of people. So a lot of different policies cropped up during the early days of the pandemic, and those policies have changed dramatically through time. Just yesterday, the CDC changed some of their guidelines on quarantine, things like that. And so in the CRM industry, there were a lot of local and regional health guidelines from counties and things like that and cities, but the CDC and OSHA were two of the mainstays. And I will say, sometimes it's been a real struggle because we're focused, for example, as a company on CDC and OSHA guidelines, but then you're going to be doing a project in some county in California, and you look at those local health guidelines from the county, and they conflict in some ways with some of these other guidelines. So what are you going to do? Those are some of the struggles that firms have to deal with time and time again. So here's another quote. Kim Redmond, she's at Alpine out of Western Colorado. I think that this quotation is a great help in terms of giving some insight. They made a very purposeful and deliberate decision to slow down work for several months. They weren't going to do any field work, and that meant luckily they were able to find work for their field staff if they were salaried and they were permanent staff. But that was a choice that they made. And frankly, a lot of firms aren't able to do that because they literally can't do that. So there were a lot of administrative procedures, and this is something I'm on the executive committee of my firm, and every single Wednesday we have a call. Almost the entire call today was about COVID and protocols and guidelines and thinking about projects and things of that nature in terms of we're starting a big project and trying to minimize contact between different staff and things like that, and trying to keep some pods of people and things like that are going to be continuous. But there were a lot of variances in terms of thinking about clients. Most of our clients were very understanding. A lot of our clients were working from home as well. But early on, a lot of big utilities, for example, sent out questionnaires to us about how COVID may affect our ability to respond quickly. And I think in some cases, the underlying current of that was, we expect you to still respond very quickly. And sometimes during COVID, that's just not a reality, right? Because there's a lot more complications, a lot more complexities that you have to deal with in terms of personnel, in terms of hotels, in terms of getting where you need to go safely and be safe once you get there. Workspaces, once everybody started working from home, certain people weren't able to work from home. Our administrative staff in our firm, they have to be behind the firewall. And for folks that do billing and receivables and contracts and all that kind of stuff, there's a lot of communication that goes on every single day. And so it's much better for them to be together. And so we had to really rethink how we did that in terms of workspaces, spreading people out, in some cases, staggering people's schedules so that, some person was there part of the day and other people could be there other parts of the day, and how to complement those things in such a way that we could continue to move forward. Things as mundane as paperwork in terms of contracts and things like that. In the past, many times contracts have to be what are called wet signatures, where you physically have to sign it. And during the pandemic, a lot of our clients and a lot of our folks that we work with have switched over to electronic signatures and things like that. But you have to think about those different kinds of protocols to ensure that things are still going to be legally up to snuff, and that you're not overlooking something that's important in terms of the rationale for wet signatures and things like that. Things as mundane as bills coming in, right? You're touching a lot of paperwork that someone else may have handled, and how do you deal with that? And we now know that surfaces and things like that probably aren't quite as dangerous as we thought they were 10 months ago in terms of COVID. But there's still something that we have to consider. And finally, HR and IT are two things, our human resources at a lot of these different firms. There's a quotation coming up about this, but they really were working overtime. And I gave this talk, a similar version of this talk to my company. And some of the folks in our HR department told me later that they, when we started talking about some of these things, it just brought back a lot of really tough memories about just trying to make sure that everybody's safe and that we're following all these protocols that are changing dramatically time and time again. And so I think that, one of the quotations that really gives you a sense of this is one by Mary, who's the president of Applied Earthworks in Southern California out of Fresno. And this analogy about drinking from a fire hose in terms of the amount of information that's coming at you that you're trying to absorb and make sure that you're keeping up and keeping people safe. And, if things conflict, how do you deal with this? And probably, working with lawyers and other stuff to try to come up with solutions where you're not going to be putting anyone in danger or liability, yourself or others. So, early on in the pandemic, there was a big run on wipes and toilet paper and things like that. And from an IT perspective, one of the things that our firm learned, because we use specific vendors for a variety of our IT things, like getting computers. Across the company, we'd like to have similar computers so it's easier to fix and things like that. And one of the things we discovered was that laptops were much like the new toilet paper, much like orange is the new black, right? Shipments from China really slowed down during the pandemic. It was really hard to get laptops fixed, right? Because people weren't going to come out and fix them anymore. And so we discovered that a lot of major corporations, once they knew that folks were going to start going home, they were buying laptops in bulk. And as a result, folks like us, we've only got 100 and some odd employees. We're a relatively small account for some of our vendors. We were pretty low on the list in terms of priorities. And so as a result, you were only really able to get the super basic laptops or the super high-end gaming laptops and not a whole lot in between. And so it's been a struggle. I mean, my laptop has a relatively large hard drive, but because I've got 20 years of stuff on it, but we haven't been able to replace it, even though there's been an issue during the entire pandemic, because it's so difficult to find a laptop with a really large solid state hard drive right now from our vendors. And other firms, you know, I mentioned to somebody else about this, and that person just laughed because they would just go to Best Buy and buy their computers. So, you know, I mean, it's a real balancing act. And there's been a lot of, you know, a lot of firms have changed direction in terms of how they do things because of the pandemic. So very early on, stay-at-home orders, even if you were deemed essential, a lot of firms across the United States really tried to limit travel early on until we got a better handle of how to do things. And so this is just one example, again, from Nate at a Metcalf about this struggle and really being apprehensive about travel. And travel restrictions are something that's been a really big issue, right? But nationally, across states and across reservations, right? Especially in reservations, which have been hit very, very hard, disproportionately hit hard. Navajo Nation has got proportionally something like 19 times the amount of cases as the state of New Mexico. Just to give you an idea of the disproportionality of how tribes are being hit. And so this is something that you really have to take into account. And even though many travel restrictions writ large aren't applicable to essential workers, there's still a lot of realities you have to deal with. And so this is just from last week. I went and figured out there's 26 states that have travel restrictions right now in terms of, if you're either coming from a state to another state that your state's known to have a high number of COVID cases, you have to quarantine for 14 days. And we were talking about this just before the talk today. There's a variety of other complications that have cropped up, including new stay-at-home orders. Like Los Angeles County in Southern California, which is the most populous county in the nation, by the way. So this may be a new trend that's going to be getting going here, which is going to complicate things again for CRM. And so, I mean, just from a practical matter, even if we're essential workers, right? If you are from Virginia and you've got a job in New York State, even if you're deemed essential, there's still going to be a large number of things you're going to have to deal with if you're going to be sending folks to New York State to work if you don't have a local office and folks already there. We came across this. We do a lot of work in New Mexico. We have an office there, and sending folks from Arizona to New Mexico for work over the last 10 months has been a lot more complicated because of travel restrictions and so forth. And you know what it really comes down to is you want to keep everyone safe, right? A lot of our work in southern New Mexico, which is ongoing, it's a very long-term project. We have folks coming from a number of different communities for our field sessions, including tribal nations. And so it's really all about trying to keep everyone safe. So early on, and this is still a struggle even today, just trying to think about sending folks to hotels and restaurants and all that kind of stuff, dining out. How do you deal with that on these projects? And so early on, folks didn't want to go anywhere, but if they did, some people thought hotels were safer. Early on, some people thought camping was safer. But there's a lot of realities with both of those, right? If your hotel room hasn't been left empty for 3 or 4 days, do we know it's been cleaned properly? It's those sorts of issues. If you're camping, this isn't a very idealized view of camping, but the reality of having a group camp and crew and the procedures and logistics associated with having a bunch of people camping and hygiene and food safety and everything else really is complicated. And so it's been a real struggle across the board for a lot of different firms. And so for many firms, they've gone back many times to hotels and they're doing single occupancy and they're essentially trying to camp in hotel rooms. So for example, our folks, this long-term project we have in southern New Mexico, for each field session, we get food allowance to folks ahead of time so that they have the ability to purchase food, pack it in ice chests, throw them in the truck, and they're camping in hotel rooms, and we're asking people not to go to restaurants, not going to markets. Once we get back from the end of the day, please self-isolate and don't go anywhere, because the last thing we want is folks getting sick or bringing, if they are sick, bringing it into the community. So field work clearly is another big thing with CRM that we're trying to consider. And there's a lot of different things on a daily basis you're having to deal with. Wearing masks, social distancing, travel, number of people in trucks, right? We have a policy now, whenever we can, only 1 or 2 people in a truck, right? To try to, these are big trucks, to try to keep some social distancing, keep the windows rolled down, access to areas. We do a lot of work on military lands, and this is really complicated things because many times you have to send in, VIN numbers and license plate numbers and other stuff to the base to get clearance for the vehicles weeks in advance. And if people are bringing their own vehicles, or if you're having to bring more vehicles than normal, or if you're having to rent vehicles because you don't have enough in your own fleet, that really complicates things if you're doing a lot of work, say, on military bases. Field work itself is a big thing that I'll be talking about in terms of social distancing and keeping clean and things like that. And just the very nature of CRM in terms of teamwork and working together, right? This photograph here is clearly before the pandemic, no one's wearing masks, but doing something as simple as doing survey, if folks are 10 or 15 meters apart walking transects, you would think, oh, that inherently you're outdoors, you're distancing, that seems very safe. But then you think about the reality of having to share the $6,000 GPS unit, or traveling to and from the job site every day, or a multitude of different sorts of things that where you're having to come in contact with each other. It's those very fundamental, mundane things that make life very difficult and complex doing field work. So, trying to think well thought out product protocols and things like that. This was one of the interesting things here is even after doing that, some folks, some field folks weren't feeling comfortable at some of the firms to go back once folks started going back in the field. This is an image of everyday life doing CRM, right? Doing any kind of archaeology. But anything where you're having to work in pairs can be difficult now, right? So you really have to think through the procedures and how you're going to do things. Field work in terms of equipment and things like that, disinfecting equipment, buying more equipment so that everybody has one of everything, so they're not sharing. And again, this comes back to the $6,000 GPS unit that you're not going to give everyone one for field work and disinfecting and things like that. Porta potties, things like that. Clearly, before the pandemic, were an important thing to consider, and now hand washing stations and sanitizing, all that kind of stuff is even more important now. And even with all of this, there's sometimes, again, difficulty with people not wanting to go back to work, right? And things like repositories. So thinking about fieldwork writ large in terms of going to repositories and archives and things like that, it's going to be a very long time until things are back to normal. A lot of these repositories are notorious for not having, the best HVAC systems, social distancing, a variety of things like that. Things like repositories, like in the state of California, all of the information centers, almost none of them are digital. You have to request site numbers from them. I'm working on a project in Riverside County right now where we requested a record search back in September, and we just heard back from them saying that we're really sorry. We've had to reduce our staff down to a single person, and as of November, we're caught up to April. So it's going to be quite some time until we get the information that we need to move forward on this project, which really has a cascading effect on the entire economy, anything dependent on archaeology to move things forward, right? There's a lot of cascading effects with that. Working with collections, touching artifacts, touching paperwork. If you're in the field and you're bagging artifacts, you have to think through the handling of these artifacts, the disinfecting of the bags. How are we going to do this, right? Are you allowed to take artifacts home? Does your contract require that? Are they sensitive and they have to be in a secure location, right? All these different sorts of things. Ethnographic work, normally when you're doing ethnography, you're meeting face-to-face with tribal members. If you're doing something like a traditional cultural property study, you're going out and visiting sites, you're doing ethnography with tribal members. All of this during the pandemic is basically stopped. And it may be actually for some projects because of the timing of the pandemic. And if, say, for example, you're interested in gathering locations, right, which are only around during, say, the spring, you may be pushing back those projects 2 years, right? Because you're likely not going to be doing it this spring. You had to stop all work last spring. So it may be 2022 until you're able to get out in the field with your tribal members to do that kind of work. And there's been a real push by the federal government to continue forward with consulting, with ethnography, with tribal consultation. And there's been a lot of pushback by tribes about doing it virtually, whether because of the nature of face-to-face relationships and exchanges, as well as the fact that for many if folks are on tribal reservations, or even if they're not, it may be that the internet connections aren't that great, or they don't have the technology available, or other things related to that, or something even more important like this quotation. The tribes are focused on what they consider much more important things like life-saving sorts of measures. I'm thinking again about Navajo Nation, a lot of other tribal reservations. So, this is a great photograph that R.J. Silva shared with us. And this really shows what life is like for a lot of people now, right? They literally brought home one of the folding tables from the office and put it in front of their couch, right? So I don't know if the table lamp was from the office or not, but I'm guessing the desk was, or the so-called desk was. So there's been a lot of different, federal help associated with all of this. The CARES Act is just one great example, and the Payroll Protection Act came out of that, or program came out of the CARES Act. That was a small business, up to 500 employees. You could get up to $10 million as a grant, a forgivable grant. And that program now is done. A lot of firms have already started to request forgiveness on their grants. But I'll tell you, there was a lot of trouble with this program in terms of getting the paperwork correct. Literally the first day that folks could turn it in, a lot of firms turned it in. And then the second day of the program, they changed the paperwork. And so everybody had to redo all their paperwork and resubmit it. During the entire process of this program over the last 10 months, the rules have changed several different times. The way that you're able to ask for forgiveness has changed. And now it turns out that it's not actually tax-free. It's going to be income, and you're not allowed to deduct any business expenses. So if you're an S Corp, for example, that's going to be personal income to you. So if you got $1 million, you may have a tax liability of $400,000 on that, which you may not have been expecting when you requested it. So, there's a lot of different factors involved that a lot of different firms went through for this. Every single firm that we contacted, that we surveyed, if they did request a PPP grant, they received it. But not all firms out of the 22 we talked to actually requested it. The FFCRA Act was another one, the Family First Coronavirus Relief Act, I believe is what it's called. This was a very important program related to things like caring for yourself if you have COVID, caring for a family member, immediate or otherwise, who has COVID or COVID-like symptoms. Childcare, if your kids are home because they can't be in school because school's closed for 6 months, all these different kinds of things were wrapped into this program, and it was extremely helpful. Women in general, I think across the board in labor, get the short shrift, and CRM, that's also the case. I think women have a much harder time in CRM. In many ways. And when you think about things like childcare and the Balance Act, right? Many times women are going to be the primary caregivers in a couple, sadly. And so all of this has been wrapped up into the kinds of things Sarah and I have seen during the pandemic, and things we've heard from colleagues and things like that. So these were very helpful. It's quite possible that the FFCRA program is going away on December 31st if Congress doesn't act. A lot of these stimulus packages, the Trump administration, the Treasury Department gave back a lot of money to the Treasury that wasn't used. So we're not 100% sure what's going to happen with all of this. So conclusions. This was another great slide, I think, that Sarah put together of a plan B for COVID. I like the Corona bottles next to the dragon there. So clearly the economy is recovering, right? And it's recovered in many ways faster than a lot of people thought. This was an article from September. There have been some sliding backs on the economy as restaurants and things like that have been forced to close again. This just happened in New York State a few weeks ago. For the time being, LA County, again, where the stay-at-home order is, they closed all restaurants to both indoor and outdoor dining starting 2 weeks ago. But even though the economy is coming back, as I mentioned, 13 million people, many of them from the service industry, folks that are on the lower end of the income scale to begin with, they're still out of work, and they're in many cases their unemployment benefits have been exhausted. So I mean, that's not good. Infrastructure has continued throughout all of this. I work with a lot of developers in Southern California, and I work with a lot of law firms that work with developers in Southern California. And the EIR process, similar, the environmental review process, has continued throughout the pandemic. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that once you get that process rolling, it's a multi-year process. And once the train leaves the station, it's very, very hard to stop that train. So we have actually gotten a lot more work during the pandemic doing environmental review and things like that, helping lawyers and their clients think through projects from an archaeological standpoint. And a lot of the stuff that drives archaeology in the United States, federal regulations, state regulations, they're still in place and they're not going anywhere, right? That's one of the neat things about this industry is there's federal regulation that mandates that we do the kind of work that we do. But not everywhere has been quite as easy. The Permian Basin, which covers both Texas and New Mexico, one of the biggest oil areas in the United States, dating back to the Second World War, when almost all of the oil that was used in the United States during World War II came from. It's had a pretty significant crash with the pandemic. This is a quotation from May from the New York Times, the epicenter of its demise. And this is the reason why. People stopped commuting, right? Most people are working from home. You know, when I was in LA last in October, I was in Southern California in October. Even a rush hour, it was very relatively easy to get around, right? And so not as much gas is being burned. And so back in January, the price of a barrel of oil was $65-70 a gallon or a barrel. Now it's at back in April during the pandemic, it dropped as low as $27 or below $27, and it's only gotten back to about 35. So all across the Permian Basin, a lot of stuff that drives archaeology has stopped completely and may not be coming back for a very, very long time. And so these are just some final quotations. Nate, really insightful here. You know, a lot of personal growing going on during the last several months, or even last 10 months. Andy Weir, who's the president of Commonwealth, I think this was a perspective that came across from a lot of folks. With the diversity comes opportunity. You know, you can't think about the past, you got to think about the future. And Joe Reese, who's the president of Archaeological Investigations Northwest out of Portland, I thought this was a great quote as well. The genie's out of the bottle, right? We know that people can work from home. So it's quite possible that a lot of people aren't going back to the office when all of this is over as much. I'll tell you, for me personally, I've really enjoyed getting up super early, working for a few hours, and then taking a break. And I may start doing that. And that, you know, after that break, I may go into the office for a while every day. I get a lot more work done at home. So how can we get through this? Be forward looking. Don't think about the past. Know where you are today and try to figure out where you're going. Be flexible. You know, again, that relates to being forward looking. Don't get stuck on what you've done in the past. Try to be flexible and work through it. And be family friendly. I mean, this was, you know, what I was talking about in terms of some of these federal programs and things like that. It's been extremely difficult on a lot of families during the pandemic, trying to work every day, whether you're in your academia or CRM or some other field, and trying to be as family friendly as humanly possible and flexible with people's work schedules, and understanding that, you know, pushing back to clients when they have some hard deadline, if you're not sure if you're going to be able to make it because of life's gotten in the way during the pandemic. And finally, trying to, you know, create some fun and a safe work environment is critical for all of this. And so finally, Sarah and I just really want to thank you all for inviting us. And we also really want to thank our colleagues, these 22 firms who spent a fair amount of time getting back to us, and in some cases offering great quotations, and several of these folks, including Chris Dorr and Senator Miller, who took the time to take a look at the draft of the article that we published to give us some extra feedback. So I'm gonna stop sharing here so we can see each other. Okay.